Hi, everyone, and welcome to another conversation with Carl. Remember to like and subscribe. Just look down and hit that subscribe button. Today, we're speaking with Katz, a self-described fermentation fetishist. Katz has taught hundreds of food workshops, and his latest book, Fermentation Journeys, Recipes, Techniques, and Traditions from Around the World, talks about the way people use fermentation in local cuisine. Sander is especially notorious for getting people excited about fermenting food. He was named one of Chow Magazine's top provocateurs, trendsetters, and rabble-rousers back in 2009. Sander is so passionate about fermentation, he's been given the name Sanderkraut. Born in New York and raised on the Upper West Side, Sander now calls rural Tennessee his home. Welcome, Sander Katz, to the conversation.
All right, I'm so happy to be here with you. I don't necessarily use the same language in my biographical description these days. So you dug deep to find that. In the early days, I was calling myself a fermentation fetishist because I had a very focused interest in it. Over the last decades, I've been calling myself a fermentation revivalist because
Okay.
I feel like that's really what I'm doing, is like bringing attention to and demystifying this phenomenon that's, really an important part of pretty much everybody everywhere's life. And yet, because most of us have so little to do with how our food is produced, most of us, it's just a complete mystery. We have no idea, what's going on or why is it relevant. So I'm so happy to be addressing some of those questions with you here today.
So my first question is, what is fermentation?
So, I mean, really, it depends who you ask. I would generally define fermentation very broadly as the transformative action of microorganisms. If you were to pose the same question to a biologist, they would say something along the lines of, fermentation is the production of energy without oxygen, anaerobic metabolism. In this sense, actually, the cells of our bodies are capable of fermentation. Mostly they function under respiration, and we have this elaborate system to carry oxygen to each of the cells of our bodies because that's the most efficient way that they can produce energy. But there's this other way. If you demand of certain muscles that they produce energy beyond beyond their capacity with respiration, with the oxygen that's available to them, they will revert to this other mode of metabolism, fermentation, and it's less efficient because it creates a byproduct, and the byproduct is lactic acid, just as with many fermented foods and beverages. But the lactic acid in our muscles gives us a feeling of a soreness. But all of which is to say, for a biologist, fermentation is anaerobic metabolism, and the vast majority of foods and beverages that we would describe as fermented, the transformation of grape juice into wine, the transformation of milk into yogurt, the transformation of cabbage into sauerkraut. The vast majority of fermentation processes are anaerobic and meet the biologist's definition, but there are a handful that require oxygen. To make vinegar out of alcohol requires oxygen. To make blue cheese or camembert cheese or any kind of cheese with a mold on it requires oxygen. So I just prefer to work with this broader lay definition that fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms. I'm going to add one but, and then I will stop. But we don't call every transformation from microorganisms fermentation. When we find like a bag of decomposed parsley buried in the back of our produce drawer, we don't pick it up and say like, oh, look, the parsley started fermenting. We have a different vocabulary. We say like, the parsley decomposed, it rotted, it's spoiled. And we generally reserve fermentation to describe intentional or desirable microbial transformations.
Because the thing that I know about fermenting would be pickles.
Sure. But I mean, you know more about fermentation because,
Yogurt,
beer and wine, fermentation, vinegar, fermentation, bread, fermentation, cheese, fermentation, cured meats, fermentation, condiments. The ancient condiments of the world are all directly fermented, like soy sauce and fish sauce. And most of our contemporary ones rely upon vinegar, a product of fermentation, to stabilize them. So, I mean, basically, there's no sandwich without fermentation. Coffee is fermented, chocolate is fermented, vanilla is fermented, certain kinds of teas are fermented. It's an extremely widespread phenomenon, and almost every person in almost every part of the world eats and drinks things that are fermented every day. Like, you don't have to be thinking about fermentation to be enjoying the products of fermentation.
So, how did you get started in fermentation?
Well, I mean, I grew up in New York City. My grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and I wasn't thinking about fermentation as a kid, but I loved pickles. And in my family, like, if the last pickles disappeared from the jar, they all turned to me because I always loved pickles. I was drawn to the flavor of them decades before I had any idea how they were made or that it involved bacteria. But, the kinds of pickles that, like, we have in New York, outside of New York, in New York, we call them sour pickles. Outside of New York, they're often called kosher dills. I mean, there's a lot of ways of preserving a cucumber or any kind of vegetable in an acidic environment. What you find in contemporary supermarkets is basically vegetables that have had a hot vinegar solution poured over them. That is also a pickle. But the kinds of pickles that I grew up with, and it sounds like you grew up with, are the Eastern European style, where there's never any vinegar added. It's basically cucumbers, a saltwater brine solution, and then generally some garlic and dill, or in different regions, people season them in different ways. But, the basic thing is cucumbers in a saltwater brine with, some kind of seasoning enhancements. And then it's a fermentation. It's basically bacteria that are present on all the cucumbers, also present on all the garlic. Actually, it's present on all plants growing out of soil on planet Earth. These are lactic acid bacteria, extremely widespread. Once you create the conditions, which is getting the vegetables submerged, the lactic acid bacteria will always dominate and acidify the environment. And that's where the practical benefit comes into, because it's a strategy for preserving the bounty of a relatively limited period of the year, so that people could enjoy those vegetables, the flavor of the vegetables, the nutrients in the vegetables for a longer period of time.
So, if I had milk that was rotting in the fridge, how do I know when it turns to cheese, and can I eat it, or do I just throw it away? Because
Well,
I
okay.
wouldn't touch that.
Well, okay, so here's the thing: is the milk that is in your fridge has been pasteurized. And so, pasteurization is a process whereby milk is heated specifically in order to kill the bacteria in the milk. And, this is like a 20th century phenomenon. Like, but for the 20th century, people generally were not pasteurizing milk. And then the dynamics of how raw milk will develop are very different than how pasteurized milk will develop. And generally in raw milk, lactic acid bacteria will dominate as the milk ferments, as microorganisms in the milk start to consume and break down and transform lactose and other nutrients in the milk. So, if the milk in your refrigerator was raw milk, it would get sour. I mean, I remember my mom, when I was a kid, she'd open the supermarket milk and smell it. And what she'd always say is, like, I need to make sure the milk isn't sour. And if it smelled bad, she would throw it away. But sour doesn't smell bad. Like, all of the milk products we love are soured milk. Like, yogurt is soured milk. Kefir is soured milk. So sour cream is soured cream. So sour is not a bad thing. Like, people love the flavor of sour. It's just that after you pasteurize milk and you create
You
what I
can't
would
make it.
describe as a high protein microbial blank slate, generally what develop are putrefying bacteria rather than souring bacteria. And so it does smell nasty, and you wouldn't want to eat it or drink it. But, if you were working with raw milk, it would turn into what's called clabber milk. And by the way, in the 19th century, nobody had a refrigerator. The milk that we grew up with is a phenomenon of the 20th century, because it's only practical to sell fresh milk if you have a way to keep it fresh. And, most milk today, and the vast majority of the milk in historically was fermented, whether the whole milk is fermented, as in, yogurt, kefir, and an incredible range of fermented milks that people in different parts of the world developed, or cheese. And what makes cheese different from fermented milk is you're removing some of the liquid, the whey. When milk curdles, you have a separation of the milk solids and fats. They float above this thinner, yellowy liquid, which is whey. So what distinguishes cheese is you're removing some of the liquid, and the more of the liquid you remove, the denser and harder the cheese, and the longer you can ferment it, the longer and more slowly it will ferment. So like, a big round of Parmesan cheese that weighs, 50 pounds, that can just like it could just sit in a deli for 10 years. Like, it's very, very stable food product. It's sour because it's been fermented. It's dense. There's not a lot of available water. It's salty. All of these things contribute to its durability as a product. But like, you walk into a cheese store and you see all these different like textures of cheese. You have your runny cheeses, you have your stretchy cheeses, like your mozzarella cheeses, you have your blue cheeses, your moldy rinded cheeses. These are all made from the same raw ingredient, and the only difference is differences of environment, which lead to differences in the fermentation. What kinds of organisms functioning under what kinds of conditions?
What is your favorite thing to ferment?
That's a hard question. I mean, I'll say like one of the things I love about fermentation is how diverse it is. In my everyday life, I ferment a lot of vegetables. Like, right now, here's some like pink kraut. That's just sauerkraut made from a mix of green and red onions. Green and red cabbage, and I probably put a little carrots in there too. I eat a lot of kimchi out of like, Napa cabbages, sometimes daikons, different vegetables.
How long do you leave it there for?
Right now it's sitting on a crock that has some more sauerkraut in it. I also ferment a lot of grains. I mean, I work with a sourdough starter and I like to bake bread, but I also do a lot of like fermented batters. So like, this is buckwheat. This is just whole groats of buckwheat soaked in water, and then I put them in put it in a blender, blend it down, ferment that another day with a little salt, and then I've been making beautiful like vegetable pancakes, scallion pancakes, things like that.
How long does it take to ferment if I imagine if you're making pickles, it takes a while.
Yeah, I mean, pickles figure a couple of weeks. And, generally cucumbers are ripe in the summer. And so, usually people are making their pickles in the summer. The temperatures are high. It goes pretty quickly. Like in my Tennessee temperatures, I mean, I just ferment them on the counter for 4 or 5 days, and then I move them into the refrigerator. Otherwise, they'll get soft and mushy. So the refrigerator slows it down, and it takes a couple more weeks for them to, really develop a sour flavor. Fermentation takes place over all kinds of time frames. So like here, this is a jar of my homemade yogurt. I generally ferment, commercial yogurt ferments for about 2.5 hours. I generally do mine for 12 to 16 hours. I get a more pronounced sour flavor, and also what that means is more of the lactose has been broken down. So, this is a relatively short process that's measured in hours.
So how long, when you take that out of the fridge, you do it for 12 to 16 hours, how do you know it's the right time to eat something?
Well, it all varies. I mean, with yogurt, I've just sort of learned, like, you don't need to do it for as long as I do it. Like, the yogurt will set, by set, I mean, this was a liquid food going in. Now it's a solid food. So it takes a few hours for it to set. Generally I would always try to keep it above body temperature. So I'm always doing this in a warmed up cooler. So I warm up the cooler with hot water. I get it to, between 110 and 115 degrees. And then I put the yogurt in there, and I try to keep it above body temperature for the first 4 hours. And then by then it's set. And then I'm just leaving it longer because I like the more pronounced flavor. The assumption of the yogurt industry in the United States is make it as little sour as possible, which is why they're doing it for 2.5 hours. So I've learned that I like a more pronounced flavor. But one of the great things about fermenting yourself is you can tailor these processes to your palate. And so I like a more pronounced sourness in the yogurt, and I like the idea of more of the lactose gets digested. But I'm doing it 12 to 16 hours. I meet people sometimes who do it for a full 24 hours. I meet people who do it for just like 4 hours because they don't want it to get too sour. So, there's not a correct or incorrect answer. It's subjective. Has it reached the stage that you like it? With the fermenting vegetables, it's really about the acidity accumulates over time. And it's not that delicious to me until it reaches a certain level of acidity. And then I'll start eating it, but then I might leave it fermenting. I don't necessarily move it to the refrigerator. The fermentation slowing device is a very useful thing in our lives, but certain foods like that, they're okay if they just, sort of keep on building up a little bit more acidity and never go in the refrigerator.
Are there health benefits from fermenting?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of health. I mean, there's always practical benefits to fermentation, and some of them have more to do with, preservation of food resources from seasons of relative plenty to seasons of relative scarcity. So, sauerkraut, pickles, even yogurt, really like are strategies for preservation because people didn't have refrigerators and it just took, more highly perishable foods and extended their useful life. But at the same time, it played a role, especially fermenting vegetables played a huge role in conquering scurvy because it's not that people necessarily knew that lack of vitamin C created health problems, but by having vegetables with vitamin C to eat all year around, people were not getting scurvy. So, it makes people better nourished if they have access to plant foods throughout the year. In terms of other benefits, probiotics. I mean, in our historical moment, there's a lot of interest in probiotics. Probiotics are the idea of like foods that have rich, diverse bacteria in them that have the potential to enrich the bacterial environment in our intestines, which can potentially improve digestion. It can potentially improve immune function. There's some, interesting new research suggesting that it could benefit mental health. So, many different systems of our bodies rely upon bacteria that are in our intestines, and which various factors in our contemporary lives can diminish biodiversity, chemical exposures, low fiber diets, different things like that. And so there's a lot of interest in eating bacteria rich foods, what we call probiotic foods, in order to enrich the bacteria in our intestines. So, that would be like number one of number one interest. Then all kinds of fermented foods, the microbial processes produce different kinds of what we would call metabolic byproducts. And certain of these metabolic byproducts have extraordinary benefits. So like, byproducts in sauerkraut are believed to be anti-carcinogenic. So there can be additional benefits to eating these foods. Then, there are certain foods around the world that are toxic if they're not fermented. So like cassava, grown in the Amazon, which is where it comes from, in the Caribbean and West Africa. Cassava just grows naturally with high levels of cyanide. And there's various strategies that people employ to remove the cyanide compound. But, the simplest one is to ferment it. And the fermentation breaks down those cyanide compounds into benign forms. Foods that are high in oxalic acid often rely upon fermentation to break down the oxalic acid. So that's another, practical benefit of fermentation in certain cases. And we can't forget about flavor. Fermentation creates extraordinary flavors, and not everybody loves every flavor of fermentation, but so many of our most beloved delicacies are products of fermentation that we just can't discount the fact that it creates these prominent flavors, which maybe not everybody loves, but those of us who learn to love them can be very passionate about our love of pickles or certain other fermented delicacies.
So when you make the yogurt, do you put strawberries in there or blueberries, or just do you eat it
No, no,
plain?
no, I just it's
It's
just
just
I mean,
plain
sometimes I'll mix fruit in it, but I just make plain yogurt.
yogurt.
And
Okay.
then more often I'll make some, like, herbed yogurt dip. I mean, just for myself, I don't need the yogurt to be have a lot of sugar in it. Like, I'm content with a more, like, savory flavor profile for the yogurt.
What's the strangest thing that you have fermented?
Well, let me just say off the bat that there's nothing that you or I or anyone has ever eaten that could not be fermented. I
Okay.
mean, like, anything with nutrients
Mhm.
can be fermented in a variety of ways. One of the and in general, what people ferment are things that are abundant in their environment. So, if I wanted to make a Southeast Asian style fish sauce here where I live in Tennessee, there's no reason I couldn't do it, but I'd have to find somewhere where I could get, like, tiny little fresh anchovies, which are, a thing that are found mostly in coastal areas. So I try to focus. I mean, I experiment sometimes on exotic ingredients, but mostly I try to work with what's really abundant. So, like, outside of my house, I have 3 chestnut trees, and I'm using chestnuts in all kinds of ways. Not all of them fermented, but this is a chestnut miso. Miso is this Japanese soybean paste, typically, that most people are familiar with as a soup, with sushi or in a Japanese restaurant. But you can make miso out of almost anything, it turns out. And miso is based on something called koji, which is a Japanese name for grains or beans with a particular fungus, Aspergillus oryzae or Aspergillus soya, grown on it. But you can grow it on other things. So this one, I grew the fungus on chestnuts, and then I mixed it with more chestnuts that I simply steamed, and then this is fermented for 2 years. And it's just this beautiful, like, savory, salty, smooth, sweet. It has so many different things going on with the flavor. I really love that. I mean, it's not that it's so weird. It's just unusual application. Here's one at the end of the season. A friend of mine just brought over all of these plants just dripping with cherry tomatoes, and we just fermented the cherry tomato.
Oh,
And this is something that, like, my grandfather, who lived, the first 18 years of his life in Belarus and then came to New York, but he loved more than anything, like, fermented green tomatoes. And, at Zabar's and places like that, like, you can find fermented green tomatoes, but these are really delicious. I've been loving eating these. I mean, I don't know I mean, I made a miso out of chicken feet. I made a chicken feet miso. I guess that would qualify as, like, a unusual ingredient. I like to experiment, and I like to play around.
do you have a do you have
Most
a
of the
group?
things I ferment are pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Do you have like in your group chat? Are you talking to a group of people that are all fermenting and sharing recipes? Have you found a group of people that do that?
I mean, my life has been filled with this. I mean, even before I wrote my books, just by having this, kind of obsessive interest and showing up all the time at people's houses, people be like, oh my God, my friend such and such is into that too. So I was meeting, I mean, 30 years ago when I first got excited about all this, I started meeting some other people excited about it. But then, certainly since I wrote my first book in 2003, Wild Fermentation, and that's when I put up a website, wildfermentation.com. But I mean, certainly since that time, I've been sort of networking with people all over the world. I mean, I have a pen pal in Iran. I've been exchanging emails with a woman in Democratic Republic of Congo. But, I mean, fermentation is just part of the culture everywhere in the world, and I've had no shortage of people to geek out about it with. There's huge networks on Instagram of people meeting each other. There's big online events. I just got my invitation to KojiCon 2026 that involves people from all over the world sharing information and resources. So, I mean, I think that, the current revival we're seeing of interest in fermentation, is really facilitated in no small part by, the fact of the internet and social media and the ease of people sharing information with each other across vast distances.
So, would you consider yourself a chef? or
No, no. I mean, I love to cook, but I mean, I've certainly never worked professionally I mean, I have worked in a restaurant as a waiter, but I've never worked as I've never worked as like a cooking professional. I mean, I've cooked for groups of people. I love to cook for friends and family, and for myself, but I'm not a chef. I mean, sometimes I meet, young chefs, and they address me as chef, but like that's in their fantasy.
do you seem like you found your passion? It speaks to who we are sometimes, is like just following it, and like you didn't go become an accountant, you
Well, I mean,
followed your.
I had a career in municipal government in New York, I basically left my career in municipal government in New York and moved to a commune. And, living in the commune, I got involved in gardening, I got involved in cooking, and, I kind of fell into fermentation at the confluence of the garden and cooking. And, then it was just sort of like a personal obsession inflicted on my friends. And then at some point, then I got invited to teach. And in 1998, 1999, and 2000, I was teaching at this annual event that some people I knew were organizing here in Tennessee. And then in 2001, I had a conflict and I missed it. So I wrote all my fermentation recipes into a little self-published zine. And, as soon as I wrote that, I was like, oh, I wonder if I could write a book. I began working on my book that became Wild Fermentation. And then there have been four other books and actually another one on the way. And, it turns out fermentation is just a huge, aspect of human cultural activity. It's like really, really important survival practices everywhere. And, if we had been born, 300 years earlier, we would just know more about it because we would see it happen. Nobody would have beer to drink unless someone was brewing it. Nobody would have vinegar for their cooking unless someone was making it. And so it was much more like in people's awareness, now that so much of food production has become centralized, we're losing a lot of that awareness, and sadly a lot of the traditions are dying off. So I'm just I'm interested in learning about these traditions, documenting these traditions, encouraging other people to help keep them going.
What's your next book about, and when's it coming out?
My next book, I mean, well, it's about fermentation, but it's a different take on fermentation. It's called Fermentation: A Natural History. And it's basically looking at the phenomenon of fermentation, I mean, if fermentation is, it's not just the food and beverage application, it's what I was talking about earlier, anaerobic metabolism. If we consider that our definition of fermentation, fermentation goes way back into our evolutionary past. So, this is a little bit about a little bit of a history of the food and beverage applications and an understanding of the biology of that, but it also tries to go into evolution and the role of fermentation in evolutionary processes.
And then before we wrap up, I want to ask you, moving to Tennessee, was that hard from leaving New York? Do you miss New
Well,
York?
I love New York. I mean, I miss the subway. I miss mass transit. I live in a rural area where, I go for a lot of walks, but other than that, I drive everywhere. And when I go back to New York, like my favorite thing is riding the subways. But like honestly, after a few days in New York, I'm always ready to go home. And so, sure, there's people I miss in New York. There's, excitement that I miss in New York. There's the subways, but I love my rural life. And I really, when I first moved down here, right away, it just felt right. Granted, I continue to have a very urban life because I've fallen into this career as a fermentation educator. In the last year, I've taught in, Italy, France, Switzerland, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Montana, Rhode Island. I do a fair amount of traveling. There's a lot of interest in fermentation in a lot of different places. So it's not like I'm like here in rural Tennessee all the time, but there's nowhere I'd rather go home to, honestly.
So, um, as we wrap up, you've written 5 books before, I think 5. You could list them and tell people what they are quickly so
Okay.
they can know where to go
So
get them.
I already showed you Wild
Wild
Fermentation, I'd say that's the best just introduction. If you are curious, The Art of Fermentation, this one came out in 2012. This is, my most voluminous book. I was a little bit shocked earlier this year to find out that the New York Times called this one of the 25 most influential cookbooks of the last century. So, this is the one that has gotten the most attention. And if you want to go on a deep dive, this is what I'd recommend: The Art of Fermentation. The one you mentioned, my most recent book, is Fermentation Journeys. And this is, basically things that I've learned about mostly in my travels in recent times. Two books that are a little bit more obscure. This is my second book that came out in 2006. The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved: Inside America's Underground Food Movements. And basically, on my Wild Fermentation food book tour, I met so many people doing interesting grassroots work that had to do with reclaiming food in various ways that I was moved to write that book. And then this book is called Fermentation as Metaphor. And, basically, once I got obsessed with fermentation, I kept noticing I'd be reading an article somewhere and, they'd be talking about like the musical fermentation of, a certain city at a certain time, the, political ferment that was happening in a certain place. But, we use fermentation all the time to describe other bubbly phenomenon. And I thought that was very interesting. And so this book is a little bit of a meditation on, fermentation as a metaphor and other meanings of fermentation.
So, and then you want to plug your website quickly?
Yeah, sure. My website is wildfermentation.com. And I list all my upcoming workshops and such on there, and I have more information about my books.
So, Sander Katz, thank you so much for joining me. And remember to hit the subscribe button if you like this conversation and you want to hear more of them. Thank you again also for joining me today. Be safe. Until next time.